to thank all of the panelists for really fascinating and incredibly diverse approaches to the theme. And what I did notice, though, I just wanted to start with one question to try and maybe bring these various approaches together before I turn it over to the audience. I think we've got about 10 or 15 minutes, so we'll go quickly. But one of the themes I noticed was this tension between sort of utility or instrumentalization in each of your presentations or talks. So Karen, thinking about the archive and what is and is not sort of seeable or usable within the archive. And it seems that what is exciting about some of those practices is how unarchivable they are and how there's something there that can't be captured by the archive. Karolin, thinking about language and patterns of language and how to either escape them or work them in different ways so to make them work for you instead of being worked by them, maybe. And the use of the diagram. And then Raju, thinking about your fantastic quote about, what happens when those kitchen table conversations get instrumentalized for academic knowledge. So it's when it goes from being useful to the community that's generating that knowledge to becoming an object of the academy. And Francis, quite clearly, there's sort of a utilitarian sort of purpose to the theater of the oppressed for various working groups and the incredible work that was accomplished through those contracts and documents, but not wanting that to be appropriated by the state, I guess, and being made into a success of neoliberalism. So maybe you can each think about or talk about how you see instrumentalization or utility shaping your work.
Oh my God.
Or not.
Weirdly, I just wanted to, there were some slides that I skipped because of time, but part of the research I was doing around the book Overlay, I started researching the theatre practice of Peter Kiddle, who taught in Dartington College, but he worked a lot with welfare state theatre and introduced me to a whole lot of performances that had gone across the country in the same era that you're talking about. Massive. So I did some sort of partial research around these kind of itinerant theatre groups and saw there's various Arts Council films. There was, the clear evidence of a very strong funding structure to kind of allow these people to create these huge multi-site performances that went on for sort of years. Yes, right. It was really fascinating to talk to him. I was sort of, Oh, okay. So I just wanted to say it was really interesting to see, weirdly, your obviously your work kind of folded into some research that I had done partially a few years ago. It was really interesting.
But there were tiny companies and big companies, but there were massive disagreements. I went to a conference where nobody would speak to me, except one person, because of something I said to other practitioners. They all stopped talking.
There's something about being disruptive that Francis is bringing back, but I think, there's kind of some of the artists that I've been talking about are, again, I guess it comes back to this in or out tension and just some things that occur around practices that maybe weren't so instrumentalized. So doing a 2.5 hour duration of performance isn't something that you could necessarily actualize now at the Royal Court Theatre, for example. So in a way, some of those materials that I've been looking at kind of also encapsulates an era of working practices that were much more unformalized. So whether it's about discussion between the movement between performance and art performance and theatre performance and the kind of segregation of those frameworks of practice that didn't necessarily exist when some of those documents were made, I think is very interesting to me, because artists like Annabelle and Carla, they cross a lot of disciplines, and it's that kind of interdisciplinary practice that is problematic sometimes to catalogue or to classify, and that's where people slip away or move away because they constantly find that because of that difficulty, they don't necessarily get shown, because art likes a linear history rather than a cyclical one. So, that's my point.
I was wondering if the question is sometimes more, who do I instrumentalize, especially when we're dealing with these references, or we refer to a certain legacy, and then talking about the dropping out story, but at the same time bringing ourselves in.
I mean, I think there's definitely an issue around that, because also I'm placing my own curatorial imperative on materials that don't necessarily require any interpretation. So,
but I mean, that can be also a positive thing. I mean, I'm thinking about the work that we're doing with the collective. We're doing a lot of work on archiving, but also unarchiving, and looking specifically at the Black Arts movement in the UK in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah.
But, you know, so often that history isn't taught in art schools, for example. Like, we didn't have access to that. It's only now after, or, you know, in postgrad, or, you know, yeah, some people don't even ever get taught that. You know, and that is important knowledge to have in the institution.
Of course.
So, you know, actually now what we're trying to do is actually, you know, there's this disjunction from cross-generational movements, and, you know, it was really, like, so important to hear what you've been doing, and I think that's where the conversation is often lacking, is that we're not having that relationship. So I think for me, having unarchiving, but also putting in our stories and our narratives and how that has impacted us and how that might impact the work, it's important that it does impact that work, and it does maybe change it and change the meaning of it. I don't know, I just think...
Yeah, I think I worked for a year on archive with Eddie Chambers, who is a writer and curator. And he has a very large and extensive ephemera collection, spanning the sort of 1980s from when he started practicing as an artist.
Is that the one that was at Chelsea that he took with him?
No, it's different. It's his own. It started off as his own archive. I did a digital iteration of some of the materials, and it was funded through the HRC, and there was a very long conversation with the University of West of England about them purchasing or, you know, acquiring the archive. But there was a real issue around them understanding the value of it. And I think that happens quite a lot, because obviously there's an implication around care and preservation that the university then has to attain, but simply he found that he was always coming up against a kind of resistance to incorporate that material within teaching history of art. So he now teaches in Austin, in Texas, because that's the university that actually values his work. And I think that's think that's quite a problem.
I don't know if that, maybe that is part of the issue, but I think it's also, this is the whole thing about the internationalism. It might be, it's the structure, isn't it? So it's like he has to go over there to be able to teach. He can't do that here. But then also he came back recently to give a talk, and he's so out of touch actually with what's going on here. So it's like, there is also, you know, and he did take that archive with him when maybe, it wasn't, the archive at Chelsea is terrible now. It's like, it's in a really bad state, and maybe he didn't need to take that with him. I don't know, it's complicated.
But that speaks to a very long set of relationship building that then gets dismantled, and it's difficult to talk about that, I think, without acknowledging the nuances, because there's a lot of fallings out and makings up that have occurred, and that's about nuance, I suppose, and sometimes collections then come to be the placeholder of those conversations, and sometimes they work to describe that, and sometimes they don't. They just provide the partial relationship, I suppose.
Well, for example, like Lubena Himid's archive in Preston, which is the Making Visibles archive, is a much better one. You know, it's much better. It comes from a queer and feminist perspective, and she's managed to build that, and she just kind of did that with her own private collection. So, you know, she has managed to do that. Eddie Chambers wasn't able to. I don't know, there's kind of different versions of this.
You know. Francis was one, and then I see some questions at the back. So.
Yes, I was going to say, just to move away from the study, is the issue of industrialisation comes to me now, because I'm looking at what we did with the printing stuff. It's very good. There are around 20 or 30 or 40 funding campaigns for that period. But then you begin to see the move from vision to excellence to portfolio. Those companies now in some kind of dreadful art marketing, which probably sets down criteria and thinks for what they're doing. If the Arts Council can grow the code of criteria, I think we screw them all the time. But which then sets a criteria which might not be able to shift in the way that we could shift them before. So everything could be a bit vague and a bit fluid, and you could jump in somewhere new. That becomes more difficult. So if we are talking about how to create a funding structure that works for us, we have to be continually very, very cautious about the issue of industrialisation and control. To make it easy, it also means sort of liquidating the Arts Council in its present form, of course, but we can't do that at the moment. So, so what works can also go wrong, just as collectives can. I worked in collectives for a long time, and eventually decided to stop. But I enjoyed it very much, and then I thought, oh, well, it's enough. I've done enough of that. But so collectives collapse. Collectives are wonderful. Collectives achieve. What do we learn from it? Where do we go from there? So it's change. It's being able to cope with continuing. I mean, I'm sure we all do in our own work.
There was a question at the back. Hi, thank you. I just wanted to think through, or ask you a comment, I guess, in terms of this idea of institutionalization and thinking through Jose Esteban Muñoz's concept of disidentification, where we work on and against the structure and the system which does all the things that you mentioned. And so there's a dependency that is sort of at stake here, because it produces dependent subject on that structure. And so I'm wondering about different models that aren't dependent on capital and qualities of capital and ups and downs, ebbs and flows, whatever. Yeah, so different models of thinking and understanding that materials are necessary and that resources are necessary. So how do we go about that? If you could comment as well.
No, I think that's the struggle, isn't it? I think it's about trying to have agency, as much agency as possible, and on your own terms to do that, because I think for me it's about redistributing from the institutions to your, like everything that I get from Goldsmiths, for example, I try and redistribute into the community and the communities that I'm directly involved in, and try not to have this separation from that, I think, yeah, I don't know, I feel like maybe being part of the community keeps me accountable for that, to be, yeah, instead of like agitating less or whatever. I don't know, I think it's just trying to be as smart as possible and just hustling. I don't know.
Can you be an accountable hustler?
I guess, yeah, why not?
I like that.
Yeah, I mean, I keep thinking about
It's contextual, isn't it? It depends on the context and the situation. But if you can get money for a project and then do something different with it, then do it. Like, yeah.
I was thinking of the workshop that happened earlier this week with Nina Wakeford, which was around the Lesbian Her Story Archive in Brooklyn, which to me has always been kind of a radical rethinking of what an archive could be, and that it's entirely volunteer run, and if you want to come access the collections, you do so through a volunteer who's a lesbian, so it's lesbians teaching other lesbians, and they refuse to partner with any institution. They've been offered many times resources to digitize their collection or to work with the university library, and they refuse because they think that that will enforce the priorities of those institutions upon their collecting practices and the way that they organize information, the way they distribute information. So it means they have things literally rotting in the basement, right, that will never be useful. No one will ever be able to listen to them. Their audio tape from the 70s is just like actually falling apart. So this tension between utility and politics, right, like the priorities are such that they would rather let them fall apart. Any other questions?
I have 2 points. One was just in relation to this.
Yeah, I had 2 points. One was just in relation to your point, which I think is really important, and was just to flag, I guess, a very precise issue around state funding, which is around reliance and what happens when that funding is withdrawn. A process, of course, which we've seen operate in such a pernicious way since the 1980s, and what vacuum that then leaves, and how that vacuum is then invariably filled with private funding. And I guess this sort of then points to a discussion that, or a point that Lan Gochety made at the beginning of this program relating to the Zabudowicz collection. So highlighting the kinds of compromise that we then make under the sort of banner of need or necessity. And then the other point I wanted to make was just to say that in relation to Karolin, Karen and Raju's presentation, that I was really moved by the emphasis on language and the way in which language means and the context that it's held in, the way that language produces meaning. And I just to sort of speak to this question of kind of curating of historic practices, which I feel, incredibly wary of, and which I think this program throws into relief in particular ways, but to think of the reduction of context historically of work by women, by people of colour, by queers, and how you begin to produce context within which that language, can begin to mean. And just to sort of, that in all of your papers, this kind of emphasis on questioning and listening, which seems, completely vital to those practices.
Who wants to go on? I can't answer the first thing, I guess. Well, I mean, I can, because it's always precarious, but yeah, I don't know if I have much to say about that. But yeah, I think in terms of the second point, in terms of the second point, is that better? Dialogue's really important in terms of how I work, so, and I'm also aware of not having a voice and then sometimes having a voice in certain contexts, like today, for example. And that it has to be shared, these platforms have to be shared in terms of how I feel about my approach, and that I don't want to pull focus from the people that I work with, really, because actually that's the whole point. So whether it's working with someone who's not actually around to voice that, I try to sort of deal with these things in a way that allows me to sort of, I guess I have a personal ethics that relates to that. But I've found through working archivally and looking at materials that sort of constellate around artworks, that there's so much disparity and interest and weirdness that exists within those documents that is so rarely articulated through kind of conventional art display. And that's really what engages me, sort of between the curatorial practice and archival practice. And that's what I found a lot with working with female artists, because predominantly the archive and the art collection are together. They're not separated because they're not necessarily within an institution, so they've not had that filtering process placed upon them. And that's kind of where you get the real meat, it's really exciting. It's also kind of, there is a certain amount of sadness, I think, sometimes, because it feels like the institution is just continuously rejecting or just not even acknowledging. But equally, institutions don't acknowledge the materials that they actually have within their own collections. So there's always that ongoing discussion, I think, to be had. But yeah, I don't want to take up too much time.
Maybe I can say something as you addressed me. The microphone doesn't like me. I tried to speak louder in the first place. So I think maybe it's also about not knowing what to say, or also it makes me a little bit uncomfortable to hear that, what you said also about, you just have to hustle and write all these applications. I mean, this is also kind of deformation that we have to go through, like to research maybe on a specific thing and a specific kind of language of withdrawing. I first have to go into a specific language and to get this money, and this is also already painful. And the other thing is why I'm interested also in this question of conversation is really to get rid of my own language and to borrow experiences also of others. And these texts that we are talking about, and also this period, it's this whole struggle around the personal as either political or the personal as, I call it, more like a material that you really use yourself or your experience or what you think and to work with, and also not to have this authenticity moment, but rather it's a technique, and to go somewhere where which you didn't know before, and there's a lot about not knowing where you end up, and not speaking from a safe position, and I think this is a very important point when we talk about this time.
Yes, this business of trying to protect your own right to be completely vague and confused and to not know what you're doing at any particular point, and protect that from the people that you have to ask for the dosh from, and to know at what point that's gone. I remember being in the Arts Council once, and I was working with a group of old Bengali people in the East End, and they said, "What are you going to produce?" And I said, I just lost it. And I said, "I think that's probably up to them." And they looked at me and I said, "Do you know the law?" I heard myself say it. "Do you know the law of uncertainty?" And they said, "No." And we left. We just sort of left 5 minutes later because we realised that there was for us, other people might have handled it better and got the money. I'm not saying it was right, but you suddenly thought, "Can't stand this, I'm off." Did the work anyway and left. But it's how to, and it's different for all of us, but maybe to know that there is that danger and to find ways of handling it is really important. I usually get somebody else to write all applications for me because I'm so rubbish at it. I mean, that's one protection.
I thought Rajiv's point, but it was inherent in all the papers, about the way I understood it, was that if funding spaces are dismantled, for instance, what also, because of the biopolitical and the mode of reason that goes along with that, not only the discursive spaces, but also the measures for judgment, one's polar star for orientation, one's line of sight, is totally also transformed. For instance, going from the 70s to the 80s was such a radical shift that measures for judgment completely changed. So one needs to have an ethics to support oneself during the times when you're unpopular, you're standing alone, these are the words you used, when you're unfashionable, when you seem to not be speaking the same language. You've got to be able to have an ethics to self-authorize yourself with your measures of judgment, orientation, line of sight, to keep yourself going through the very dark vicissitudes which come politically. They come and go. Spaces open up and they close. I think that's quite important. I think also just one other thing. In the 70s, I think you could have a counter underground space that counted power. But I think now it's got to be this asymmetrical going in the folds and holes within infrastructures, with the knowledge that these different little small micro theatres of action join together to form a long front in the vast space of revolutions becoming. All the revolutions we've been talking about.
Have the last word.
You said that's what we're doing.
Did I?
Yeah.
Oh, right.
Very silently.
I think it's good to be a rabble-rouser, basically. Following up from Francis' example, it's good to be a rabble-rouser, and it's good. I think, especially from our perspective and the collective perspective, we're entering spaces where we're so often discarded. We don't really have much to lose in that sense. Like, it's painful. You're saying it's painful, but it's never going to not be painful in a sense. So coming from that perspective, as a starting point, just causing as much trouble and agitating and just speaking out about it. Actually, with the collective, we've got more, I guess, more resources, opportunities to talk and so on from doing that. It didn't work when it was like one of us doing that. It's so easy to be isolated, to just dismiss. But because there's a collective of us, it's been like there has been strength. And then people are like, "Oh, you're actually part of a collective. Okay, now we want to hear what you have to say." But then also being part of a collective, yeah, we are different. There are disputes. There are these problems. But on the flip side, you know, we can share the workload, the resources, the skills, be accountable to each other, you know, share opportunities, and so on. So I think it is about kind of coalition and collectivity.
That's actually, I think, the perfect place to end. But then I want to thank you all for your presentation.
Thank you.